Welcome everyone this is our 6th year of Summer School of Faith. So this is actually our 7th program if you count up all the programs. So we're old friends now. This year's program is themed Restoring the Sacred in a Secular Age. You might recall last year we looked at this same kind of topic in the context of Catholic renewal in the writings of Pope Benedict. We're going to broaden the lens now this year to look at secularism as a cultural phenomenon and try to understand more how that has impacted not only culture but the church. And as we proceed, we'll see that secularism is a kind of heresy about the doctrine of creation, and we'll develop that more as we go. But our theme for this year is how to restore a sense of the sacred, the transcendent, in a secular age. These are two quotations in your handout, one from George Orwell, which kind of captures the drift that has been occurring in culture in the West over the last several hundred years. And we will develop more what that consists of as we go through today's class. And then you have the quotation from Karl Marx, which he was famous for in his early writings, that philosophy is really about revolution and change, productive in society. Our topics for this program then is, let's look at secularism and the crisis of what's called modernity, which is really the time we're living in. Sometimes you might see it referred to as postmodern. We won't make those fine-grained distinctions for today or this class because they're not necessarily helpful. But modernity means the times we're living in today and all of the cultural assumptions and philosophical positions that go with it. It affects the arts, literature, music, and so forth. Then we'll look at how secularism has crept into the thinking and practices of the church, specifically the Catholic Church. This is not meant to be a beat on the church like a piñata class, but it's more just to identify how the church has embraced the worst elements of secularism and how that has obscured the sacred, the transcendent, the beautiful. And we'll spend some time on that so that we can then know how to respond to it. Then the next 3 classes are really a presentation on the church as sacrament. Vatican II described the church as a kind of sacrament in the context of the universal call to holiness that we all have. The church functions as a kind of sacrament. The next class then is on human sexuality as a sacred covenant. And we will retrieve and reclaim and elaborate a framework for understanding human sexuality, which is lacking today. And we'll show how the church historically has worked out of a framework from a teaching standpoint that perhaps has not been as helpful as it could be. Then the last class is a spiritual reflection on the fall and rise of St. Peter as a kind of model for purification and redirection and renewal of church leadership, and frankly ourselves as well. As some of you have commented to me in the past and others have noted, this era that we're living in, given with the failures of leadership in the church, may be a moment, a opportunity for us as lay people to begin to provide guidance and direction and participation in different ways to help the church walk through this difficult time. So we'll spend some time on that in the last class. You'll note that the week of July 1st, we're off for the 4th of July holiday. So we'll skip 1 week and then we'll jump to July 9th. Lastly, I would mention all of this, what's coming is on YouTube, and all of the past year's Summer School of Faiths are also on YouTube. So you might have missed that, but YouTube, Church of St. Mary, Charles Craigmile, if you type that into the Find section of YouTube, up will pop my smiling face and some music. So let's begin. Let me summarize where we're heading. And you'll get a feel for what are we up to in this year's program. As I said earlier, we are currently living through a secular culture. And I put a little more content to that. It's actually a cultural Marxism and nihilism, or nihilism, culture that we're living in. And so I'll put a little more flesh on that skeleton as we go in this class tonight. But what is that? And as I mentioned here, secularism really means the political philosophy that we can define our own sense of existence without reference to God or the Judeo-Christian heritage, without reference to religion or the transcendent, the sacred of any kind. We can pull ourselves up by our earlobes in a secular point of view. We even recall the phrase, the separation of church and state, which of course doesn't appear either in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, but it's spouted as if that's part of our founding documents, and it is not. So secularism is actually a kind of toxic heresy, which we will elaborate on. Secular culture itself is in breakdown, as I call it. You would have to be living on Venus or not sentient to know that our culture is fragmented, divisive, no shared sense of what it means to be a human being anymore, no shared sense about what is the common good, what is our origin, what is our destiny. When those things are no longer shared or there's no consensus about them, we see the fragmentation in our culture today. The core reason for that fragmentation is that secularism does not have a rational foundation. You might say that's an interesting way to put it. We thought you might say it doesn't have a spiritual foundation. Well, it lacks that too, but prior to that, it lacks a rational foundation. What is the origin of human rights, after all? Nothing has been persuasive or convincing in the absence of God or the sacred. The next point I make here is that the crisis in the church today, the most obvious example is the sexual abuse crisis and the collapse of the bishop's leadership. I'll argue that's a symptom of this broader crisis of the embrace of secular, godless culture. So it's in the news about the sexual abuses of clergy on innocent people. That's how this has shown up. But it's been preceded by decades, perhaps centuries, of embrace of toxic secular culture. And class 2 will see what that looks like in music, in architecture, and in some of the core theological teachings and opinions of certain people. I also mention here that secularism is a Gnostic heresy concerning the doctrine of creation. I will talk more about what I mean by Gnostic in a moment. But for those of you who attended past years, you know that Gnosticism is an ancient philosophy and an ancient heresy in the Catholic Church in the first 4 or 5 centuries. Basically what Gnosticism is a recognition, incorrectly, that there's an antagonism between spiritual reality and material reality, that the two don't go together, that they can never go together. And so the Gnostics, ancient Gnostics, solved the problem of evil in the world by saying, well, there's a good God of the spirit, and there's an evil God of matter. That's one way of solving the problem of evil. So Gnosticism, at its root, is not comfortable with the congeniality of spirit and matter, which we do affirm in Catholicism and Christianity in most cases. Last point here is only through what I call the reverence of the sacred can we heal a wounded and broken culture. And we will elaborate that as we go, particularly in classes 3, 4, and 5. So I should mention that we will now start with tonight's topic. Bishop Sheen, who I had the opportunity to be an altar boy for, do you need some water? Okay, you have water. Okay, very good. That's all right. Bishop Sheen, who I had the opportunity to be an altar boy for, once said that there appears to be major crises in the life of the church every 500 years or so. So in the first 500 years, we had what are called the christological controversies. Who is Jesus? Is he God? Is he merely a man? Is he a confused mixture of kind of sort of both, or one or the other? Who is Jesus? And we had the beautiful formulations of the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, which we pray at Mass, and an even greater refinement in the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. But who is Jesus? That was the controversy of the time. The next one is the schism between East and West, between the Eastern churches, the Orthodox churches, and the Western churches and Rome. So the conflict between Rome and Constantinople. Who is the head of Christ's body, the church? In the next 500 years, we had the Protestant revolt or Reformation. Who is Christ's body? Who's the church? Who's the authentic community of God? And in a deeper way, how am I saved? How am I really saved? The question Luther asked. The crisis of our time, Bishop Sheen noted, was the crisis of the world. What does it mean to have a world? What does it mean to be a human being? Can I have a world and be human without dependency on God? This is the crisis of our time, and they seem to occur every 500 years. I'll read a quotation to you from someone who's in your bibliography, Eric Vogelin, who wrote a book on this very subject, Science, Politics, and Gnosticism. And he notes that crises like this, cultural crises, seem to occur during rapid change in society. Now, he's talking about ancient crises, particularly in this passage, which I'll read to you. The collapse of the ancient empires of the East, the loss of independence for Israel and the Hellenic Greek states, the population shifts, the deportations and enslavements, and the interpenetration of cultures reduced men who exercise no control over the proceedings of history to an extreme state of forlornness in the turmoil of the world, of the intellectual disorientation, of material and spiritual insecurity. It's a lot like our time now, isn't it? Of the profusion of Gnostic experiences and symbolic expression, one feature may be singled out as a central element in this varied and extensive creation of meaning: the experience of the world as an alien place into which man has strayed and from which he must find his way back home to the other world of his origin. The world is no longer the well-ordered cosmos in which Hellenic Greek man felt at home, nor is it the Judeo-Christian world that God created and found good. For him, the world has become a prison from which he wants to escape. If man is to be delivered from the world, the possibility of deliverance must first be established in the order of being. In the ontology of ancient Gnosticism, this is accomplished through faith in the alien, hidden God who comes to man's aid, sends him messengers, and shows him the way out of the prison of the evil god of this world, be he Yahweh or Zeus. True philosophy springs from love of being. It is man's loving endeavor to perceive the order and attune himself to it, the order of being. Gnosis desires dominion over being. In order to seize control of being, the Gnostic constructs his system. The building of systems is a Gnostic form of reasoning, not a philosophical one. So he's referring to ancient Gnosticism, and as I just touched on, the good God of the Spirit was not the God that Jesus incarnated. Jesus incarnated the God of matter, which is why the Gnostics could not affirm that Jesus was God, because God doesn't get involved directly in matter. So that was the ancient Gnosticisms that exist today. We have similar Gnosticisms today as well, which I will point out. So you have a clash, which Eric Vogelin hints at. During historical crises, you have the clash between a Greek medieval, what I'll call classical philosophy or metaphysics, which is love of order, a recognition of order in nature, in the universe. Logos is the Greek word for logic or rationality or reason. In the beginning was the Word. In Greek, in the beginning was the Logos. So it embraces the order found in nature, in the universe. And it is given. We don't construct it. We discover it. We recognize it. It's a source of morality in classical thinking. The cosmos was not indifferent to behavior. If you read the whole cycle of Greek philosophy, particularly Plato, and marched into medieval times, nature, the universe, is signposts to how we ought to act because we are part of the cosmos. And in fact, the cosmos is for us. Gnosticism, before I touch on that, I mentioned also the God revealed in the history of the people of Israel in the Old Testament is the God of classical times. And we even have wisdom books in the Old Testament that have a influence from Greek philosophy. Things like Sirach, Proverbs, and so forth. Gnosticism rebels against external being as given. It doesn't want that. It doesn't like that. It seeks to liberate itself from any notions of anything given, which we will see. And it typically shows up in dualisms between spirit and matter, the finite, the infinite. How does it show up today? It shows up today, for example, in the area of sexuality, where what your gender is has no relevance to what your biology is. Matter should not determine what my sexuality is. I don't even want to use that word sexuality anymore because it has a biological connotation. I'm dragging this boat anchor of matter, my body, behind me. So my spiritual self, my true self, determines my gender. Sex means biology. Gender means my spiritual self. You see how Gnosticism show up today. We'll touch on this in class 2. Gnosticisms also show up in a worship of the earth, oddly enough. The spiritual earth, where human beings should give sacrifices to the earth like the Aztecs did. And it shows up today, and we will go through the data of this. It's not just me saying this, in the extreme versions of the global warming movement of today, of licking the earth, as Pascal would describe, this worship of the earth that ancient tribes and barbarians did. We now have our modern mythology for Mother Earth. And if we worship the earth, there's no reason to worship anything else. Utopian movements. We'll touch on several of them today, but the one I just mentioned is a kind of return to a pristine atmosphere for the world. Deindustrialization. We need to return to a simpler time, environmentally speaking. This is this misplaced utopian because we've rejected an eternal life, a heaven, after this life. So we need to substitute something to keep ourselves sane. And as I mentioned here, the latest course offerings in the humanities at any major university. If you read them, if you read the curricula of major universities in the humanities, in social sciences, in philosophy, it reads as one long grievance party, the grievance industry. I hate to say it, but if you read the minutes of the Catholic Theological Society of America, it reads as one long grievance industry. It's been largely corrupted, not completely, largely corrupted by secularism. So, with that, let's keep rolling. So these are the historical crises that I touched on before, and their Gnostic alternatives. As I mentioned and covered briefly, Jesus is not God because God doesn't have anything to do with matter. This was the ancient debates that occurred in the first several centuries of the church. Modern Gnosticism, in the sense of modern philosophy that occurred and started in the 17th century and continued largely midway through the 19th century. The essence of this is the turn toward the self. Remember Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum. He wrote it in French first and then later translated into Latin. Reference back to the self to construct knowledge that we have. So there's a rejection of material being as a starting point, a disconnect. It's me, myself, and I in my subjectivity trying to understand my thoughts and get back to things. Whether it's Descartes, Hume, or Immanuel Kant, they never get back to things. So material being is withdrawn. That's the modern Gnosticism of the 17th and 19th century. The cosmos, the universe, is no longer a source of wisdom. Classical metaphysics of understanding what is the good, the true, the beautiful, no longer on the menu. That is constructed by the human mind. We'll spend maybe a little time on that, but that's more of a heavy lift, and there's probably not enough caffeine in the Cokes to keep us going. And then contemporary Gnosticism. I refer to Marx and Nietzsche here, who were both 19th century philosophers. This is the culture we're living in. And through a series of texts in your handout, I will show you how we are all living in a cultural Marxism now in the West. And that secularism, this heresy of the doctrine of creation, is fed by the streams of Marxism and nihilism from Friedrich Nietzsche. So we'll spend some time on that. I want to quote from a passage from Pope Benedict XVI, which you saw last year, and you actually saw a few years before that, but it's such a powerful summary of the Enlightenment program. We all feel like we're part of the Enlightenment. We're kind of critical, knowledgeable people now. We all have subscriptions to The Economist and the New York Times. And so we're enlightened. We feel, well, the things of the past, you know, they were limited in their knowledge of science and other things that we're aware of now. So look at how the Pope describes the Enlightenment project. And as I put there at the top, the whole program of the Enlightenment was to establish the non-controversial claims of Christianity without appeal to the church or God. So things like God exists, or you have a soul, or the common good in society. The project of all those philosophers, Descartes, David Hume, John Locke, Hegel, the whole group of them, without appeal to the church or classical metaphysics of the Greeks and Aristotle and Aquinas, let's reestablish these important concepts: God, soul, the common good. Let's see how Pope Benedict looks at it. Quote, "But at this point, speaking as a believer, I should like to make a proposal to those outside the church. In the age of the Enlightenment, the attempt was made to understand and define the essential norms of morality by saying that these would be valid even if God did not exist. Think of the holy wars of religion, so-called, of the 17th century and back into the 16th century. The Enlightenment program was trying to say, if we stop killing each other for a moment, let's find agreement without appealing to God or any religion or church. In the situation of confessional antagonism, that's what I'm talking about, the religious wars, and in the crisis that threatened the image of God, they tried to keep the essential norms of morality outside the controversies and to identify what he calls an evidential quality in these values that would make them independent of the many divisions and uncertainties of the various philosophies and religious confessions. The intention was to guarantee the bases of life and society, and in more general terms, the bases of humanity. At that time, This seemed possible since the great fundamental convictions created by Christianity were largely resistant to attack and seemed undeniable. But that is no longer the case. The search for this kind of reassuring certainty, something that could go unchallenged despite all the disagreements, has not succeeded. Anyone here a Cartesian today? Anyone here a follower of Immanuel Kant or George William Frederick Hegel? No. So it has not succeeded. The attempt carried to the extremes to shape human affairs to the total exclusion of God leads us more and more to the brink of the abyss, towards the utter annihilation of man. And so you see the trajectory of thinkers down below there. And in 3 minutes I will summarize them unfairly. But part of my job here, as the job description of Summer School of Faith, is to summarize 500 years of history in about 3 minutes and capture all the nuances. But think of Descartes. He was a mathematician. The Cartesian coordinates, the XY axis. Some of you are still in school and you maybe studied some geometry or some basic math. You remember the equation y equals mx plus b for a line? That's on a Cartesian coordinate. Descartes, René Descartes, a very intelligent human being, a great mathematician, probably the greatest French figure after Napoleon. He was a rationalist, and he wanted to establish that God exists, you have a soul, morality, by looking at undoubtable thoughts and, like in geometry, making conclusions from undeniable axioms. The problem is that he failed at that, because what he came up with whatever was clear and distinct is true, and we can reason from that. But what if it's not clear and distinct to you that God exists? Because he has to assume the existence of a good God to validate his sensory knowledge in the Meditations. Unfair move. Philosophers have exposed this for centuries, and so that as a result, no one takes Descartes particularly seriously. But he started a trajectory in thought in the 17th century, early 17th century. David Hume, he's an empiricist, very similar to the sciences today in some sense. Think of a pool table. David Hume, as an empiricist, said any idea you have has to be tied back to a sensory impression. All your ideas are faint copies of your sensory impressions. So all these ideas about God, your soul, causality, a big metaphysical concept in Aquinas, don't exist because I don't have an impression of causality. For example, David Hume's pool table. You all play pool, you hit the cue ball, you see it moving, you see a click, and it hits another ball. If you say the cue ball caused the other ball to move, you didn't see causality, you heard a click and you saw motion. But the idea of cause doesn't have an empirical basis. It's just our psychological expectation. Uh-oh. So that led to a skepticism, which Immanuel Kant wanted to correct by creating something called the a priori conditions of mind. Now, what on earth is that? Think of navigation. Latitude and longitude, do they exist? No. They are a construct of the mind to organize navigation on the globe. They organize experience and make it true. There is an equator. There are countries on the equator. So the a priori conditions of mind mold our sensory experience so that we can conceptualize about it. You see the withdrawal from material being to concepts of the mind by which I synthesize my experience? Hegel took that further and said, why make those conditions subjective? They are in history. Geist was the German word he used. God, spirit, thought in history, working out concepts. Karl Marx is going to have a lovely field day with that notion of history being progressive. For Hegel, it was a secular version of God's providence, working in history. For Marx, it will be the class conflict in history leading to revolution. That's why I put avalanche area there, because with Hegel, it's the end of the happy path of reason in the Enlightenment. And we get thinkers now, like Karl Marx, where we now see the breakdown of secular reason. We see how obvious it is that it was a failed project in Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. What does Marx claim? And we won't do a whole thing on Karl Marx here. It's only 3 slides. But I put 3 slides in here because you will appreciate what we're living in now. Man is simply a being unto himself. Anything outside of himself creates dependency, alienation. He is self-sufficient, complete in himself. Now, Marx doesn't argue for this materialism. He just says it's obvious. And as he says somewhere on metaphysics, if you give up on your abstractions, you'll give up on your questions. All history is a history of class conflict. First line of the Communist Manifesto. There's an antagonism in the classes, historically speaking. And all history can be read through the lens of this clash between whether it's feudalism and the serfs, all the way through to bourgeois societies and the conflict between capital and capitalists and owners and labor. And the proletariat is, for Marx, this kind of unique, they didn't necessarily ask to be part of the proletariat, particularly if you spent most of your time behind barbed wire, but the proletariat functions as the people of Israel in a secular form for Karl Marx. They are working out salvation history, small s. This overcoming of alienation between man and the fruits of his work, and the conflict between capital and labor. So the proletariat for Karl Marx enacts this political and economic salvation history for now, in time, not some imaginary afterlife, which is alienating because it doesn't come from me, and I in some way would be dependent on it. So the concept of an afterlife is just a fiction created by a certain higher class to alienate the rest of us. These mythologies about God and heaven are all crushing dependencies on our shoulders. So you see the antagonism that starts with Descartes between subject and object, this alienation, which then works itself through the small intestine of Hegel, of Geist, spirit in history. This antagonism between a rejection of metaphysics and material being plays itself out in Marx saying, political history, this alienation has played out between capital and labor, and I am telling you how we overcome this alienation without reference to this nonsense of God and what is transcendent, which caused the alienation in the first place. So let's look at a few quotations. You'll hear this expression, dialectical materialism, about Karl Marx, and it really comes from dialectical idealism of George W. Hegel. So a few quotations from Marx. Philosophy makes no secret of it. The confession of Prometheus, in a word, I hate all the gods, is its own confession, its own verdict against all gods, heavenly and earth, who do not acknowledge human self-consciousness as the supreme deity. There shall be none beside it. I should note that Hermes replied to Prometheus saying, you are grabbed by a certain kind of madness, which will connect later to something Nietzsche wrote called the madman. But continuing with Marx, and that was from his doctoral dissertation when he was a young man. But in the next quote, mankind becomes master of nature, but man the slave of man. The result of all our inventions and progress seems to be that material powers become invested with spiritual life, while human life deteriorates into a material force. We find ourselves agreeing with that, actually. Think of the new technology that's available to us. In some way it captivates us and makes us captive. Thinking of the cell phone and how we are so dependent on the internet now. We become, in some ways, reduced. And material things, like the internet, become spiritualized. Social media. This antagonism between modern industry and science on one side, modern misery and corruption on the other side, this antagonism between the forces of production and the social conditions of our epoch is a tangible, overwhelming, and undeniable fact. We recognize in this antagonism the clever Hegel's cunning of reason, which keenly proceeds in working out all these contradictions. We know that the new form of social production to achieve the good life needs only new men. And Marx was commenting on the revolutions of 1848 that occurred all over Europe. Note that we would be mistaken if we thought Marx was first proposing an economic and political theory of revolution. It first rests on changing what it means to be human. There's a metaphysic here that is primary, and it's something that Marx never abandoned. He's proposing actually an entirely different view of what it means to be human and to have a world without God. The foundation of irreligious critique is this: man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Indeed, religion is man's self-consciousness and self-awareness insofar as he has either not found himself or has lost himself again. Man who sought a Superman in the imaginary reality of heaven and found only a reflection of himself will no longer be inclined to find just a semblance of himself, just a non-man, where he seeks and must seek his true reality. The summons to abandon illusions about his conditions is a summons to abandon a condition that requires illusions, namely a religious culture. The critique of religion is therefore in embryo the critique of the veil of tears, of which religion is the halo. The struggle against religion is therefore indirectly a struggle against that world of which religion is the spiritual aroma. Religion is the groan of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the spirit of the spiritless condition. It is the opium of the people. And this was taken from his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. This is present today, for example, in state and our federal court rulings, that what before was a default position of recognizing the role of religion in the public sphere, now the default position is religion has to establish that it's not violating other secular commitments for it to be recognized. For example, the baker who doesn't want to make wedding cakes for homosexual couples. He had to demonstrate that his convictions were sincerely held and that it didn't violate, or he wasn't looking to violate directly, the rights of the homosexual couple to a wedding cake. You see how what's different today versus 150 years ago in this culture? The default position is religion. You must demonstrate that you are a secular participant now, that you will behave at cocktail parties, that you won't raise subjects that we just assume not talk about, and so on, and so on, and so on. There's been a flip-flop. So secularism is not just some benign option that the founders really intended. Secularism is an enemy. It's not a neutral space in any sense of the word. And Marx is telling us that. As we read from Augusto Del Noce, it's also in your bibliography, he wrote a work called The Crisis of Modernity. Therefore, the core of Marxist philosophy, which is already found in the writings of his youth, and to which he remained always faithful, must be identified as the rejection of every form of dependence on God, on the common good, on what is true, on what is beautiful, what is loving, and thus the extinction of religion, since God is the archetype of the worldly Lord. Hence, the revolution represents a transition not just from one social situation to another, but from one stage of mankind to another. The transition from one to another requires a revolution capable of transforming human nature itself. You see how its political and economic theories are based on this atheistic, materialistic metaphysic, which we are currently living under in the West. So with that happy note, let's turn to... You know what Karl Marx's mother said about him. I've said this before. He talks a lot about capital. I wish he'd go out and make some. That was the role of Frederick Engels, for those of you who are historians, who was the son of a factory owner who bankrolled Marx throughout his whole life. So we'll just put that aside. So Friedrich Nietzsche, another 19th century philosopher, 1844 to 1900, is the murderer of God, philosophically, and the prophet of nihilism. What is nihilism? It's hard to say. It comes from a Latin word meaning nothing, negation. And nihilism is that all ideas and values must be rejected. And the only fundamental outlook is the human person in freedom. All other things that come from the outside are impositions and veiled attempts at will to power. Counterfeit, dehumanizing, for Nietzsche, examples in history of will to power. And that the healthy will to power is the individual freed from these things that are relative made absolute by others, like the church, like monarchies, like the flabby governments of Europe of the 19th century, Victorianized Christianity of the 19th century, weak, limp, effeminate Christianity. And someone who was similar to Nietzsche but also very different, Soren Kierkegaard, compared the clergy of his time to tea leaves wrapped in 4 pieces of paper that had been used 3 times before. They had no tang, they had no zest, they had no evangelical conviction. They were just 3 hots in a cot, keeping the doors open, getting their stipend, which characterizes much of Christianity in Europe and in this country, and Catholicism as well. We've lost our tang. We're stale, like those tea leaves. So man in freedom is the only standpoint for Nietzsche. Nietzsche is attractive to us today because the political messianism, the utopianism of Marx, is a difficult thing to square with history. Meaning, Marxism, other than in academic faculties and certain political candidates, no one really thinks it's a credible political philosophy. Nietzsche knew this. And though Marx and Nietzsche, it's not clear they ever read each other or even knew each other, there's no group messianism for Nietzsche. He was too much of an elitist himself. Which is why the Übermensch, we translate that quickly as Superman. That has connotations to superheroes now. So most philosophers who reflect on this might translate that super race. Nietzsche is trying to call out members of races, which will be reused by the Nazis, to this special calling that only a few can accomplish. The courage to choose one's path freely. And you can see echoes of this in our culture today. He had a great deal of psychological depth, more than Marx did in terms of the psychological impact. And I want to read to you something from Nietzsche from The Joyous Science. The German word is a word where we get our word frolic from, so kind of the playful science. And Nietzsche suffered from migraine headaches his whole life. He suffered from nausea, and so he wrote in what are called aphorisms, short little bursts of insights in various passages. And let me read you one of the most famous ones from Nietzsche, and it captures the psychological stakes of what's at risk that Nietzsche even recognized while being an atheist. So this is entitled The Madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning light, ran to the marketplace and shouted incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." As there were many people standing together who did not believe in God, he caused much amusement. Is he lost? Asked one. Did he wander off like a child? Asked another. Is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone to sea? Has he emigrated? And in this manner they shouted and laughed at the man. Then the madman leaped into their midst and looked at them with piercing eyes and cried, "Where did God go? I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where are we heading? Away from all the suns? Are we not constantly falling? Backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions running around? Is there still an above and below? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothingness? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is night not falling evermore? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we hear nothing yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing yet of the divine putrefaction? For even gods putrefy. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we, the most murderous of all murderers, ever console ourselves? The holiest and mightiest thing that the world has ever known has bled to death under our knives. Who will wash this blood clean from our hands? With what water might we be purified? What lustrations, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must not we become gods ourselves, if only to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and because of it, whoever is born after us belongs to a higher history than all history before. And then here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners. They too were silent and stared at him, baffled. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, so that it broke into pieces and it went out. The madman said, "I've come too early. This is not yet the right time. This tremendous event is still on its way and headed towards them. Word of it has not reached men's ears yet. Even after they are over and done with, thunder and lightning take time. The light of the stars takes time to reach us, and deeds, too, take time before they can be seen and heard. This deed is further away from them than the farthest star, and yet they have done it themselves." So we may not agree with the conclusions, but Nietzsche accurately describes the psychology at work in atheism and its need to find substitute realities and make them absolute, even while denying the absolute. So we see from Eric Voegelin this final quote: "The underlying significance of this symbolism is now clear. And Diogenes, Nietzsche was actually doing a riff on an earlier story about Diogenes, who went out in the marketplace and said, 'Where is man?' So I'll just point that out. So the new Diogenes does seek God, but not the God who is dead. He seeks the new God in men who have murdered the old one. He seeks the Superman. The madman is therefore looking for man, but not the man of the philosopher. He is looking for the being that springs from the magic of the murder of God." And continuing with Voegelin, this is the motive of the murder of God. The aim of the periuastic. Parousia, you might remember, is that Greek word in the New Testament meaning the coming of the Son of Man. Parousia. So this parousiastic Gnosticism, this secular version of the coming of the Son of Man, is to destroy the order of being which is experienced as defective, unjust, and through man's creative power to replace it with a perfect and just order. Lower CO2 emissions. Now, however, the order of being may be understood as a world dominated by cosmic divine powers in the civilizations of the Near East, or the creation of a world transcendent God in Judeo-Christian symbolism, or as an essential order of being in philosophical contemplation. It remains something that is given, that is not under man's control. In order, therefore, that the attempt to create a new world may seem to make sense, the givenness of the order of being must be obliterated. The order of being must be interpreted, rather, as essentially under man's control. And taking control of being further requires that the transcendent origin of being be obliterated. It requires the decapitation of being, the murder of God. The murder of God is committed speculatively by explaining divine being as the work of man. Man makes religion. It does not suffice, therefore, to replace the old world of God with the new world of man. The world of God itself must have been a world of man, in God a work of man, which can therefore be destroyed if it prevents man from reigning over the order of being. The murder of God must be made retroactive speculatively. This is the reason man's being himself is the principal point in Marx's gnosis. And he gets his speculative support from an explanation of nature and history as a process in which man recreates himself to his full stature. The murder of God, then, is the very essence of the Gnostic recreation of the order of being. MLM. Metaphysical lives matter. Classical metaphysics, medieval, Christian theology matters. And it's not optional if we want to live in a sane society. So, summary. We can take a breath, and yes, there will be time for questions at the end, but I wanted to get through the material. As I said, we fought 2 world wars in the last century and defeated, from a military standpoint and a political standpoint, fascism and communism as political and military realities. What I'm arguing is that in the West today we have embraced with both arms the metaphysics of cultural Marxism and nihilism. We have embraced it. So we've just celebrated the 75th anniversary of the landing at Normandy, D-Day, where we defeated fascism in the form of Nazi Germany. And 75 years later, we have embraced the very irrationality and nihilism that was at the root of the Nazi ideology. And my exhibit A, B, and C would be the latest ruling on abortion law, same-sex marriage, the limitations of the church to provide adoption services in this country. Catholic charities in certain states cannot offer adoption services unless they offer children to gay couples or transgendered couples. So this is not theoretical. This isn't Charles reading long-winded passages from Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. This is happening right now, and I know all of you are aware of that. And many of you are on the front lines of that battle. This is the ideology that undergirds the opposing side. When you talk to someone who's perhaps living a lifestyle that isn't according to the gospel, the response is, you should walk a day in my shoes. Who are you to tell me what I should think and do? Me, myself, and I am the source of my own sense of what is good, true, beautiful, and any appeal outside of myself is an imposition, is a crippling, alienating imposition from outside of myself. In class number 2, we'll see how this has affected the church teaching on conscience and has obscured it. But I have to give you teasers for class 2. So it's what I call functional atheism. So if you took a person aside or people aside, are you an atheist? They'd say, no, I believe God exists, but maybe as a secondary factor. As Cardinal Newman, John Cardinal Newman, the great Anglican convert, said, most of us don't live our lives first according to the will of God. We live our lives according to our own will without offending the will of God. So no one would say I'm an atheist per se. God is a secondary factor, like my physical therapy appointment or my tennis lesson. It's on my calendar. It's on the to-do list. But is it the reason why you even have a to-do list? So we are left with this limpid, flaccid philosophy of well-being today. You see it in the car commercials, the open road. It's the journey, not the destination. Really? What if that open road has a cliff? So, and yet this is in our DNA, our cultural DNA. It's the journey, not the destination. Why? Because if we start talking about goals and purposes in nature, in creation, and the dependency it implies on the God who made it, that's an awkward conversation. I have to now align myself to something outside of myself that is not me. That might prick my conscience to start having all kinds of unpleasant thoughts. So, we emphasize means, not ends today. We're all connected, a global community. You see the IBM commercials on TV, the internet, blockchain, artificial intelligence. For what? Now, there are many good things about those things. Don't get me wrong. I'm in technology. I run a technology company. But we're talking about philosophy now. And the secular world has absolutely nothing to tell you about ends. We're all connected through cell towers. But what are we connected for? I love Amazon.com also. What is it for? What is it all for? So, if the question of the 17th century, or even go back one, the 16th century of Luther is, how am I saved? Here I stand against the Catholic Church. How am I saved? Ultimately, that answer will be, grace does not make real contact with me. The transcendent doesn't touch my nature, which is corrupt. You remember the images Luther uses? We are a dung heap, and God snows on us with grace, covers the dung heap, and declares us justified. Or we're like a cub in the mouth of the lioness. The lioness takes us. Or horse and rider, where the human nature is the horse, God or the devil is the rider. There's no real contact. There's no rejuvenation of human nature. There's no beatitude within nature. It is corrupt, and the transcendent can never touch it. What's the question of modern philosophy, and how was it answered? How do I know? Material being never makes real contact with the human mind. The transcendent, the objective, what is apart from me, can never touch me to form a true thought of that thing in itself. What's the question for today? In today's nihilism, today's Gnosticism of the separation of spirit from matter, the two never touch each other. So what today, the philosophy of well-being through technology is, how do I overcome the material limitations that my true self, my spiritual self, is living under? If I'm a young couple and having trouble having children, let me experiment with the latest medical technologies of in vitro fertilization or in artificial insemination, cloning perhaps on the horizon. You see how there's a separation of the good that we find in God's creation as normative is rejected. My true spiritual self are these goods that the church says I should have a family. So I should be able to pursue any means, even if they violate this grasp of a divine order in human nature. So the philosophy of today is, how do I overcome material limitation? a dualism. Now, obviously, I'm a big supporter of modern medicine to enhance and build upon what is natural to us or therapeutic to us. An organ transplant isn't terribly natural for those who've gone through it, but it promotes and enhances the good of the overall person in a real biological way. So we'll spend some time on that, another teaser for you, in the class on human sexuality, which is probably the most visible thing we have in culture today of this nihilism, this tearing asunder of spirit and matter, of body and soul. Here's a long quote. We'll go through it quickly, and it's from an interesting writer named David Bentley Hart. We're coming toward the end. Don't worry. So what have I been describing? The late modern picture of reality is, culturally speaking, something altogether unprecedented. In the days of, say, Thomas Aquinas, there was no particularly cogent alternative to seeing nature as a rationally ordered continuum in which all things witness to a final good, at once cosmic and moral. Not so now. The modern person's failure to find a moral meaning in nature's forms is not simply attributable to a perverse refusal to recognize objective truths. There is now a story that makes nihilism, in the technical sense of disbelief in any ultimate meaning or purpose beyond the physical, plausible and powerful. With the rise of the mechanical philosophy, modern persons begin to conceive of natural ends not as inherent purposes, but merely as useful functions. Even those who believe that the exquisite clockwork of the universe has been assembled by an intelligent designer still regard physical nature as an amalgam of intrinsically aimless energies upon which order has been extrinsically imposed, and so not as a natural revelation of the divine logos pervading all things. Then, with the rise of Darwinism and finally of an essentially mechanistic neo-Darwinism, entirely new and seemingly exhaustive account of physical order and causality came into being, one in which there was no such thing as intrinsic natures, but only local coalescences of diverse and meaningless material forces. So in effect, I'll just stay with the headlines here. The cosmos is no longer seen as enchanted, as some writers describe it, but merely an object for study by the natural sciences. No longer a source of moral wisdom. What's true and moral are merely historically agreed to preferences. What other appeal would you make for them? There's nothing objective about them. Next, the human person has no special dignity. Why would the human person have any special dignity versus the environment, versus an 1,000-year Reich? What's one person in comparison to the Reich? Nothing. Meaningless. Subject to, provisional. Raw material for history working out itself. Metaphysical questions need to be suppressed. And I mentioned two examples there which we've talked about in past years. DNA, which functions like computer code for the assembly instructions of amino acids, which are the building blocks of life, written in a way that is more complex than any novel, any work, bears the traces of a metaphysical question of could that be iterated to by chance in 12 billion years, in 12 trillion years, in 100 trillion years? And the answer is no, from basic probability. Or the origin of the universe. Any mechanical, physical cause or law that Stephen Hawking might refer to still has to exist. The law of mathematics of 2 plus 2 equals 4 doesn't put $4 in my pocket. The laws of physics do not cause being. These questions must be suppressed, especially in schools. Lastly, And this gets back to the illusion that the secular is just a benign space for us to have a dialogue. This substitution of the sacred for the secular is not a benign substitution. Why? We were made for the infinite. Our hearts were made for Thee, O Lord, and they are restless until they rest in Thee. We were made for the infinite. And if we're an atheist and we don't find it, we have to create infinities, causes, utopian movements, to replace the God and the heaven that we've rejected. So, for secularists, they make, as I mentioned, the relative absolute. They're guilty of what they criticized Christianity for. So with that, this crack-up, as John Paul II and Pope Benedict called, is the eclipse of the sense of God and man, life without foundations. And as a result, we are going through what they call decomposition culturally, socially, individually. Shards, they refer to it as. Sharp objects. You break something that is whole and integral on the ground, you don't get a nice array of things in order, smooth edges. You get shards that will cut you. You drop a wine glass, a beautiful wine glass, or a vase, if it's expensive, a vase, and it breaks into pieces that are shards that will cut. They don't go back together. And in the end, we should take comfort from the fact that the church has faced heresies before. And secularism is this heresy regarding the doctrine of creation. Namely, as I put it, that reality is not complete in itself. It cannot give an explanation of itself. Namely, how did it even exist? What are these norms of morality we sense and see and argue for throughout history? Are they nothing, as Nietzsche thought or Marx thought? The denial of cultures in the West that are denying their origins. When John Paul II was Pope, the United Nations could not even acknowledge the Christian origin of Europe. And so these acts of self-suffocation, as Cardinal Sarah describes them, in the West, unique to the West almost, of this rejection of our origin, of this rejection of creation, the doctrine of creation, that God created it and it was good. This rejection has led to the decomposition. And it is a heresy on a basic doctrine of creation. The element that I put here at the end is that there's a rebellion. So secularism is not just a neutral stance of, I don't think God created the world. It is a rebellion from dependency on God. It is toxic. It is a foaming pathology in culture, not to recognize dependency on God. It's not just simply another option on a form that you check. Secularism, cultural Marxism, don't lead to a dead end. They lead to a cliff. And this is the warning. This was the basis, in many ways, of John Paul II's pontificate. Pope Benedict XVI's program of pointing out the relativism of Europe and the West as a danger. The current Pope Francis, in his clear moments, I just want to see if you were listening, talking about the throwaway culture. That's what they're all pointing to. And so this pathology is in the heart of our culture in the West now. And so with that, I'll end on a happy note, and it tees up the other classes that are coming up. Secularism is not the final word. It's not even the first word. We have a loving, ordered, rational origin. We are not a cosmic afterthought with an irrational, blind chance origin. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. God says yes to nature. God says yes to the cosmos. And God has entered time and space. The infinite has become finite. The transcendent has become immanent. The alienation that Marx and Nietzsche talked about was healed in the Incarnation. And so this is the actual good news. This is the real revolution, not the godless, mad dog foaming at the mouth variety of Marx or Nietzsche. We think of Paul at Athens. Remember in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 17. And he points to a monument to the unknown God. And the Greeks were like, oh, that's interesting. Tell us about that God. And Paul is telling them about it. And then he says, oh, and by the way, Jesus Christ, who became a man, suffered and died and rose from the dead to save us. And they said, it's cocktail hour. We'll hear you on this another time. We have to be careful what we bargain for here. God has come to us in Jesus Christ. If the transcendent stays transcendent and safe, I don't have to make this radical commitment. But if he does come, and he has in Jesus Christ, that changes everything. So that's what I wanted to cover tonight. The next classes will be how has the church embraced some of the worst elements of secularism that I described in this class. And thank you for soldiering on with me. But it's important what we know what the enemy is, so we don't chase shadows. If the church only did this, if they only had this administrative commission to review all cases of sexual harassment, then we would have everything solved. In my judgment, and this is the argument I'm making, that's just a symptom. The administrative bishop is that tea leaf that has lost all of its tang. Who's talking about how do we prevent it from occurring in the first place? Sexual abuse. Imagine if you were the CEO of McDonald's. And McDonald's, I looked up beforehand, serves about 1 billion or 2 billion hamburgers every day throughout the world. And it's believed that 1% or so, more or less, of priests in the U.S., maybe it's less, has abused someone. And the response of the bishops has been, well, we need to set up committees and review boards to prevent this from happening. Imagine if the CEO of McDonald's said, well, this is a Western phenomenon. We're going to set up centers in every major town. If you ate a cheeseburger and got cancer, please report to this center and we'll adjudicate your claims. Maybe you had something before you ate the burger. We'd like to take a blood sample to see what was in your blood. Maybe you're taking drugs. But if you were CEO of McDonald's, wouldn't you say, solve the problem? Why are we cooking burgers that are giving people cancer? It's called a product recall. Root causes. I ran an operation for a food company. We had 4 factories in the U.S., 1 in Mexico. We had a product recall once. So we had to decide, well, did it come from all the plants or one plant? Oh, it came from one factory. Okay, phew. So we start narrowing it down. What materials are they using that are different from the products that are manufactured in the other sites that are identical? Oh, and we narrowed it down and found the root cause to prevent listeria. So the bishops who are concerned with process, administrative process to adjudicate claims, it's the worst kind of response because it's hopeless. It's the drudgery of the bureaucrat, the soulless, gray, grim processing of insurance claims. Ridiculous. Where's the discussion of virtue? Where's the discussion of a spiritual life? What are the underpinnings of a spiritual life? We haven't heard much about that. Some bishops are talking about it. But let's pray for the bishops meeting in Baltimore this week. Their agenda is about process, but let's hope there's an awakening as well about root causes, which are in the spiritual life, which is class 5. So very good. We started a bit late. I ran 2 minutes over time. Are there any comments? And thank you. So Charles, you spent a lot of time critiquing Marxism. What about, and I'm paraphrasing, the evils of capitalism that can also breed secularism? Did I capture that correctly? And that's a very good point. And the popes in their social teaching, in particular John Paul II, but even going back further, have talked about unbridled capitalism generates its own kind of slavery to consumption of goods without a stewardship of the common good or reference to God. So capitalism can be just as godless as Marxism in history. The difference, though, is capitalism is not inherently atheistic. Marxism is. So capitalism is a tool by which supply and demand of goods and services are coordinated freely through the free exchange of transactions of individuals. There's nothing inherently atheistic about that. There is something inherently atheistic about revolution, which must be violent, and that the dignity of the human person is not rooted in God, but rather has no transcendental dignity at all. So when the popes talk about Marxism, it's always condemned largely because it's inherently atheistic, inherently antagonistic toward the faith, and in history has been a disaster for humanity. Most of Eastern Europe was turned into a large barbed wire concentration camp in the 20th century. I am saying in general, and we can just speak in generalities at the moment, and then market capitalism has created an economic miracle in all of civilization, West and now East, over the last 300 years that has been unparalleled in human history. Have there been perversions of it? Absolutely. But Marxism is inherently perverted because it is godless. And if you look at just life expectancy or quality of life metrics, number of people living in poverty, number of life expectancy in 1900 versus today, it's about a 30-year difference, all due to higher standards of living driven by market capitalism and innovation. Those are features of market capitalism. What are features of Marxism, empirically speaking? If we looked at Marxist societies, what would we find? We would find bread lines. We would find camps. We would find school curricula that is determined by the state. Oh, wait a minute. That's the U.S. now. I'm sorry. Let me give another example. But I'm being lighthearted, but we would find brutal facts in Marxist society that we would find completely unacceptable that we do not find in largely market capitalist societies. But very good questions, and I thank you for asking them. Yes?
I think that,
way in the back. How are you? But I expect that. So the question, thank you. So the question is, if Jesus is the answer, why is the world still fallen? And Summer School of Faith 2014, Class 4. No, but to answer your question in a more serious note, good and evil are always wrapped up with human freedom. The reason why there is even a sense of fallen in the first place is human freedom. If we are free to be saints, we're free to be devils. What good is it if we were good the same way grass is green or diamonds shine? Does God have need of things that have virtue in that same way? If he had a universe of diamonds built up to the stars, what does that light compare with one free act of a human being under grace for the good? That was worth God dying for. The God who made the Grand Canyon and mountains and the stars, what need does he have for things that are good like robots? None whatsoever. Boring. But if life is a theater of character making, a drama, where your charm is so beautiful because you say yes, even though you have the possibility of saying no, that's worth it. And that's why we live in a fallen world. God didn't solve it in terms of how we would expect him to, but he solved it truly by his death and resurrection, by overcoming sin and death, which are the fruits of evil. Well, natural law is part of classical metaphysics, and the order in the cosmos that the Greeks recognized, and that medieval philosophy and even in the first millennium of Christian philosophy recognized, that creation was created good, and it is revelatory of God's design for us and for all of humanity. And that a natural law emerges out of the fact that this order in the cosmos has implications for the order of the human person, who is a member of the cosmos. We don't stand apart from the cosmos. We're in the cosmos. And it is revelatory of purposes. And we find in human nature, remember, Aristotle, the majority of Aristotle's treatises are on biology. He's studying functions and purposes he finds in organisms. What's a good apple? Well, it's an apple that doesn't have a worm in it. What's a good knife? It's a knife that can cut. Its function is seen in its design to achieve a purpose. If it's a good knife, it's sharp. It cuts. It achieves the purpose for which it was made. Human nature, what's its purpose? Remember from the Baltimore Catechism? In this world to be with him in the next. That's our purpose. And we see the echo of that in our nature, and it is fully revealed in Jesus Christ. So nature, it turns out, is pretty important to make rational our faith. Our faith isn't irrational. There's a congeniality between grace and nature. They work with each other. They're in some ways knitted together. Yes. Well, good. You've all been very good. We'll see you next week. Thank you.